Up until now, we have only considered the happy path of authentication and authorization. Now it's time to think about possible exceptions. We would like to handle them properly and send meaningful responses back to the client so that they know exactly what goes wrong. There are many Spring Security exceptions. Here I listed some common ones. I grouped them into two categories: authentication exceptions and authorization exceptions. Actually, we have already considered the first two authentication exceptions: username not found exception and bad credentials exception. We defined how to handle them in the ControllerAdvice class. Account status exception will be thrown if a user's account is either disabled or locked. Invalid barrel token exception will occur if the submitted JSON web token is invalid. For authorization exceptions, access denied exception will be thrown if a user does not hold a required authority to access a resource. So next, let's define how to handle account status exception, invalid barrel token exception, and access denying exception in our ControllerAdvice class. Let me toggle over to IntelliJ. Right now, I'm in this class, Exception Handler Advice, under System Exception Package. As you can see here, we have already taken care of username not found exception and bad credential exception. So let's copy this, paste. And here we're going to handle account status exception. Account status exception dot class. And the response status is still 401. No problem. Copy this, paste here. And here we can change this message to user account is abnormal, either is disabled or locked. Next, let's consider invalid barrel token exception. Invalid barrel token. Response code is good. And this time it is invalid barrel token exception. And here is the message. The access token provided is expired, revoked, malformed, or invalid for other reasons. Now for the next exception, this time is called handle access denied exception. Access denied exception. Now this time, instead of 401, we should use forbidden 403. Forbidden for the message, simply just no permission. Okay. It is recommended that in your ControllerAdvice class, you define a fallback exception handler that handles any unhandled exceptions. So let's copy this, paste here, Let's call this handle other exception. This will be exception. Same thing here. And this time, the status code will be internal server error. And the message will be a server internal error occurs. Fallback handles any unhandled exceptions. So this last handler will only be called if none of above, those above exception handlers, can handle this exception. Then the exception will go here. If one of the exception handlers can handle the exception, then this one will be skipped. Okay. Let's do some testing in Postman. So let me launch my project. Let me toggle over to Postman. First, this is the correct username and password. Send. And no surprise, we got user info and token. Everything's great. Next, let's try to use an incorrect username. For example, John1. We don't have John1 in our database. So click send. We're supposed to get 41 with a message, username or password is incorrect. So send. Well, it's interesting. We get a 41, but there's no response body. It is empty. Now let's try this. Username is correct, but let's provide a wrong password. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, 8, 9. And click send. We still got a 41, that's correct, but the response body is also empty. What's wrong? Don't stop here. Let's keep trying. Now, let's make sure we have the correct username and password and send. Okay. And let me copy this token. And then go to, for example, find all users. Bearer token. Send. Everything's fine. Now I want to mess up the token. For example, here, I'm going to delete M and 3. Okay, save. Apparently, this is not a valid token anymore. So if I click send, and I'm supposed to get the access token provided is expired, provoked, malformed, and blah, blah, blah. So let's click send. We got a 41, which is correct. But again, the response body is empty. I can keep trying, testing account status exception, testing access denied exception, and so on and so forth. And there's one thing in common, is that the response body is empty. And apparently, the exception handlers we just defined don't work. So what should we do? Let's go back to IntelliJ. The problem here is that Spring security exceptions are thrown by the authentication filters before invoking the controller handler methods. And our ControllerAdvice class can only catch exceptions thrown from a controller. That's why it cannot capture those Spring security exceptions, because they are thrown before the flow arrives at the controller. So what if we want to handle those exceptions uniformly in a ControllerAdvice class? Is that possible? The answer is yes, but we have to do some configurations. In a nutshell, we need to implement several custom AuthenticationEntryPoint classes. So let's work on that. I'm going to close this and go to security package. First, let me create a custom authentication entry point for our HTTP basic authentication. Right-click, new a class. And let's call it custom basic authentication entry point. And let's annotate this class as component. And then we're going to have this class implement AuthenticationEntryPoint, which is an interface provided by Spring Security. And it's not happy because we need to implement an interface method called commence. Click OK. So first, let me inject a bin into this class. Private final handler exception resolver. Let's just call it resolver. And then let's define a constructor to inject it in. Here is a little tricky. We have to use an annotation called qualifier for this formal parameter. Handler exception resolver. Otherwise, you will get a problem. What happened here is that there may exist multiple bins of type handler exception resolver. So we have to explicitly tell Spring which one we're looking for. That's why we need this add qualifier. We need the bin with name handler exception resolver. So Spring will inject that one into this class. Otherwise, Spring will feel confused and does not know which bin you want, because those bins all have the same type, that is handler exception resolver. Okay, just remember this. You have to have this add qualifier to annotate this formal parameter. Okay? Then, inside this commence method, first let's add a header to the HTTP response. www-authenticate basic realm equals escape double quote realm escape double quote. Then this dot resolver dot resolve exception. I'm going to pass request response. And here is a handler which is null, and this exception to it. Quick summary. This class implements AuthenticationEntryPoint interface, and it is responsible for handling unsuccessful basic authentication. If a basic authentication fails, this commence method will get called. We first add a header and then delegate the work to the handler exception resolver. And this resolver will resolve this exception so that this exception can be handled by an exception handler method in our ControllerAdvice class. I added some comments here for your reference. Next, let's go back to the security configuration class and override the default basic authentication entry point. Okay, and here is how we do it. Right now, we're using defaults. HTTP basic dot authentication entry point. And here we should pass an instance of the custom basic authentication entry point. So first, let's inject it in. Okay. Then let's go down here. This dot custom basic authentication entry point. There we go. So now if you provide a wrong username or wrong password to our HTTP basic authentication, then we'll see a meaningful response body. Next, let's do the same thing for the bearer token authentication. So right-click, new, a Java class. Let's call it custom bearer token authentication entry point. Add component, implements authentication entry point. So let me copy some code here. We don't need that. And here, let me add a comment. This class handles unsuccessful JWT authentication. Everything else is the same. So be very cautious when you do copy and paste. Okay, all right. Let's come back to security configuration and register this entry point with OAuth2 resource server. Dot and authentication entry point. And the same thing here, we need to inject it in first. This dot, custom bearer, make sure you pick the right one. At this point, our exception handler method will work when the bearer token is invalid. Now, there's one last thing to do is to make access deny exception handler work. So let's come here, right-click, class. So this time, let's call it custom bearer token access denied handler. And this time, it implements access denied handler. Okay, implement this handle method. Okay. The rest will be similar to the authentication entry point classes. Private final, handler exception resolver, just call it resolver, and constructor. It's good. Make sure here is a qualifier. And here should be handler exception resolver. Okay, and down here, this dot resolver dot resolve exception, and everything the same. Request, response, null, and this time the exception is access denied exception. Okay. Then let's make this a component. And also let me add a comment here. this class handles unsuccessful JWT authorization. Okay, now let's go to security configuration and register this access denied handler with OAuth2 resource server. But first, let me reformat. Okay. Let's keep chaining access denied handler. And we have to first inject it into this class. Private final custom barrel token access denied handler. Okay, and then let's add this to the constructor parameter list. And now, as you can see, there are 3 formal parameters in this constructor. Okay, then let's go down here and just pass this dot custom barrel token access denied handler. Good. All right, at this moment, it should work. So let's do a quick Postman test. Let me stop this and run it again. Okay, it seems like there's no error. Okay, so let's toggle over to Postman. Let's go to login. So first, let's have a valid login. Send. Good, it's good. So let me copy this token for future use. Copy this. All right, so this is a valid token. Now next, let me try a wrong username. So John1, click send. Okay, so this time we're getting 401, good. We're also getting this very good result format: flag, code, message, and data. Okay, so same thing here. This time, username is correct, but this one is 789. Send. Okay, same result, right? All right, then let's go to find all users. So let me just delete something else. Okay, this is a bad invalid token. Okay, so let's click send. All right, so this time it shows us 401, the access token provided is expired, blah, 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 or invalid for some reason. Okay, now if this is a good token, paste, save, send, everything works fine. All right, then let's also test authority or access deny. So this time I'm going to use Eric to log in. Eric does not have admin role, so Eric cannot delete a user. So if I remember correctly, 654321, that is Eric's password. So click, it's correct. Let's copy Eric's JWT, copy, and let's go to delete a user. Delete, and then paste. Now this is the token from Eric. We're trying to delete a user with ID equal to 3. All right, so let's click send. Okay, now this time we got a 500. A server internal error occurs. Data is access denied. That's weird. Because the exception is handled by the ControllerAdvice, that's for sure. But not by the handler method we want. We want it to be handled by the handle access denied exception method. And we're supposed to get a 403. But now we're getting a 500. It means it is handled by the fallback exception handler. Okay, so this is really weird. Let's go back to IntelliJ and do some debugging. As you just saw, that exception was handled by this one. That's why we got a 500. But it is really supposed to be handled by this one, handle access denied exception. And let's take a look at this class here. Okay, so that is a problem. We imported the wrong access denied exception. So the current one is from java.nio.file. So that is a file access denied exception, but we're looking for a Spring Security access denied exception. So of course, that exception will not go here, but fall back to this one. Okay, so that's the wrong class. And it is pretty easy to fix. Let's go all the way up here. Let me delete this exception. And make sure we import the correct one. Yeah, that's the one. The access denied exception from org.springframework.security.access. Okay, that is why we need to test the program. As you can see here, the compiler was not complaining because that access denied exception is a valid class. It's just not the class we're looking for. Now let me run again. Turn off. Launch it again. And let's go back to Postman. But this time we do have to log in again. Send. Delete. Paste. Save. And click send. And hopefully this time we'll get a 403. There it is. So 403, no permission, access denied. So the lessons learned here is that make sure you import the correct classes, because those kind of bugs are pretty hard to debug. The compiler is not complaining, everything looks good on paper, so be cautious when you import classes. All right, the last quick Postman test I want to show you is the account status exception. So let's go to login again, and this time we're going to log in using Tom. And here is Tom's password. Another very robust password. Send. So what happened here is, actually, Tom's account is disabled. So Tom's enabled field is false. Even though we provided the correct username and password, we still cannot log in. It says, for one, user account is abnormal, user is disabled. Now, here is a small homework. Try this one. If we do not provide username and password to this login API endpoint, what will happen? And what is the returned message? And have we considered this situation? If you were me, how would you fix this problem? Please write some code in the exception handler advice class to handle this scenario. I hope you have learned how to handle Spring Security exceptions in a ControllerAdvice class. As you can see, using Postman to manually integrate test API endpoints is tedious. In the next video, let's talk about how to perform API integration testing when Spring Security is on. We will automate the testing tasks. See you in the next video.